Good morning. Welcome to the newly reconfigured experimental Rector's Forum in the church. I'm really glad you're here, and I don't even have to tell you to move up, so that's how well behaved you all are. Just a couple quick announcements. I want to welcome those who are joining us via stream. We're really glad to have you back, have our forum schedule back. I can hear barking on the lawn. That's a nice sort of background noise. And if you're new to us, if you're not on our email list and you're not getting reminders of the forum every week, there are green clipboards. I feel like a stewardess. There are green clipboards to the doors over here, and you can sign your name and email address, and we'll put you on our email list. Also, if you're new, I invite you to stop at the welcome table on the lawn. It's a red table with red welcome bags full of information about All Saints Church to get you going in our life here. And finally, just want to give you a heads up about an event happening this afternoon, 3:30 to 5:30 in the Guild Room, sponsored by our Middle East Ministry and Friends of Sabeel. It's Current Realities in Occupied Jerusalem with Dr. Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian, professor of Hebrew University. So there are flyers on the lawn about this. Please consider coming back for that event this afternoon. Over the summer, as Muslim communities were increasingly attacked in political rhetoric, and especially when Gold Star mother Mrs. Khan was questioned about why she, a grieving parent, didn't speak out at one of the party conventions, we knew who we needed to hear from at our first Rector's Forum this year. Edina Lekovic is the public affairs consultant for the Muslim Public Affairs Council, one of our great partners. Previously, she was the director of policy and programming and oversaw initiatives in government and policy, media and communications, and leadership development. From 2004 to 2010, Edina served as their communications director and appeared regularly in major media outlets, including CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, CBS Television, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times. As an appointee to Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti's service cabinet, Edina has been committed to promoting relationships between diverse Angelenos for nearly 15 years. As co-founder and current chair of New Ground, a Muslim-Jewish partnership for change, Edina is proud to have been part of an impactful program whose high school dialogue program was named Governor Jerry Brown's top interfaith group in 2013. She joined the faculty of Bayan Claremont, part of the Claremont University, as an adjunct professor in 2013, where she teaches religious and spiritual leadership in a Muslim context. She is co-founder and graduate of the American Muslim Civic Leadership Institute, and also co-founded Elevate, an arts-based youth leadership program. She has an MA in communication from Pepperdine and a BA in American Literature and Culture from UCLA. And just last week, many of you were at a wonderful gathering where she was honored and recognized as an emerging interfaith leader at the Not in God's Name conference honoring George Regas. For the past 40 years, All Saints has been blessed with interfaith partners who have taught us, mentored us, moved us, and inspired us. And it is our pleasure this morning to welcome another in a long line of great leaders and one of our favorite very best friends, Edina Lekovic.
Good morning, everyone. Got to step back. So coming to All Saints is coming home. There are few places I feel as welcome, as at home, and as at peace as I do when I come to All Saints. I am not just those things that you heard. I'm also a Pasadena resident. I live on the other side of the freeway, and so All Saints has become a deeper place of home for me in many, many ways. And I'm here today to talk about women in Islam. And before I go into that, I want to recognize how special this place is, because every time I'm here, I also remember that this pulpit right here is the first pulpit I ever gave a sermon from. And that was by invitation of Reverend Ed Bacon, inspired by Reverend George Regas, and bringing to the idea of bringing someone else in to preach blew my mind, my spiritual mind, because it's not something that I have seen within the Muslim community or in many other faith communities to date. And it says it's just one more piece of evidence of the profound spiritual home that you all have chosen to be a part of. And I feel very lucky and blessed to be here, and especially after last weekend, and feeling the charge of Reverend Regis, feeling the mandate, the obligation, and the opportunity that I have, along with my interfaith partners. Another emerging interfaith leader who was honored was Reverend Francisco Garcia, also, whose home is here at All Saints and is working elsewhere, as well as Rabbi Ken Chasen. So much of what I bring to the table, so much of what I bring into the world has been informed by my life in interfaith activity, and my spiritual life has been enriched by what I have learned from other faiths. So for those of you I haven't met before, with a name like Edina Lekovic, you might guess where my parents are from. They're from the former Yugoslavia, and my family has been Muslim for generations. And yet, when I was growing up in San Diego, my experience with Islam was that of a cultural Muslim, in the sense that I understood Islam as a list of things I wasn't allowed to do, as most kids understand their faith, probably. And yet I didn't have any attachment to I couldn't tell you what are Islamic values, what are Islamic teachings. And that only changed for me when I went to college and I started my own spiritual journey. And has been deepened and enriched by the work that I have been able to do with the Muslim Public Affairs Council and more broadly in the interfaith community. Because with every question that has been posed to me, I've had to learn. With every accusation that's been thrown at me about Islam, about women, about so many topics, I have had to learn more. I have had to dig deeper. And that has, again, only enriched me. There have been many points in the journey where I thought, man, if I keep digging deeper, there's going to be a day where I don't like what I find. But what I have found is quite the opposite, that there are answers and there are multiple interpretations on a whole variety of issues, again, in all of our faiths, and including Islam. And as we dive into the subject for today, around Muslim women, facts versus fiction, I would like to spend my time focusing more on facts than fiction. As a communications person, golden rule number 1 is don't repeat the stereotype, right? Tell your story. Don't focus on what you're not, focus on who you are. And so I intend to spend no more than 20 minutes here sharing my experience and what I know in this subject, and then I turn it over to you to ask your questions. And feel free at that time, you're not limited to, you don't have to avoid the stereotypes. I'm happy to talk about them, but I choose not to focus on that for the most of my time. So I hope that you understand where I'm coming from. And again, this is All Saints, so I know that you do. So for those of you who don't have the basis of how the Quran talks about women, the Quran, our holy scripture, which follows the Torah and the Bible, was revealed at a time when female infants, baby girls, were being buried alive in the desert because it just wasn't, it wasn't beneficial to have a girl. And this, we could particularize this and say, those Arabs in that time were brutal and inhumane. But this was the standard around the world, right? The world was in its dark ages, if you will. And so this was the norm. And at that time, in that place where women were treated literally as property, the Quran, this direct message from God, started, its foundational story of the creation story starts in declaring men and women equal from that point of creation. In the Quran, we believe that God tells us that God created one soul, and from that soul created its mate. And from the two of them spread all of humanity, essentially. And in that telling of that creation story that involves the Adam and Eve that we all know, what I found when I was in college and read that story for the first time was, this is gender neutral. This is different than what I expected. And within the story of creation, there's the story of individual accountability, that both Adam and Eve are held responsible for both choosing to defy the rule that was given to them. and that they both carry that individual responsibility and that individual free will. Neither carries more than the other. Against that backdrop, the Quran went on to give women the right to an education, the right to choose who they wanted to marry, the right not to be married against their will, even more explicitly, the right to divorce if needed, the right to keep your name, your family name after you get married, which I do, the right to keep your income as financial security and freedom. So the Quran teaches that the Quran, like all of our texts, is heteronormative and rooted in a traditional family structure, right, of man and woman. And in the Quranic telling, the husband's responsibility is to provide for his family, right? And the wife's responsibility is to rear those children. And if she chooses to work, then she is entitled to keep her own income so that she has a way out if she needs it, right? So that she's not stuck because of finances. And so this is among many things. And the Quran also gives women a right to inheritance, a right to participate in public life. And it values our voices as women. Within the Quran, there are a total of about 18 women mentioned. Only one of those women is mentioned by name, and that's Mary, mother of Jesus. And she is as close to a female prophet as we have within the Quran, because God spoke to her almost directly. And she was inspired and had this life inside of her that God placed there. We too believe in the Immaculate Conception. And so this is among the many stories in the Quran. And the one verse that I'd like to read to you from the Quran was revealed. We understand that it was revealed because most of the verses of the Quran are directed to mankind or humanity, right? Or to, "O you believers," or "O men." And so a woman came to the Prophet Muhammad one day and said, why does God only speak to men? And challenged this idea. So even that, and instead of turning her back or saying, "How dare you question God," Muhammad took that in and he meditated on it. And lo and behold, a period of time later, there came a verse that said, "Verily, for all men and women who have surrendered themselves unto God, and for all believing men and believing women, and all truly devout men and truly devout women, and all men and women who are true to their word, and all men and women who are patient in adversity, and all men and women who humble themselves before God, and all men and women who give in charity, and all self-denying men and self-denying women, and all men and women who are mindful of their chastity, and all men and women who remember God unceasingly. For all of them has God readied forgiveness of sins and a mighty reward." And so this provides for us this foundation, this blanket, to believe in our equal equality and stress the equal accountability before God and our equal responsibility on this earth. And so Muhammad took the teachings of the Quran and he put them into practice by not just allowing women to be in the mosque, but by setting aside a whole day of the week where he would only meet with women, so that he could give them extra space and time and privacy to be able to talk about the issues they wanted to address. And he said to the early Muslims, "The best among you are those who are good to their wives and children." He was known to have never raised his hand or raised his voice even to the women in his life, or children for that matter. And he also taught us that heaven lies at the feet of your mother. So when we think about this backdrop of what we're taught as Muslims, it's a strong foundation that gives me a lot of support in my foundation as a Muslim feminist. I don't have to go away from Islam to find my ideas of feminism. I find them rooted there and supported in other places. But now when we think about these ideas and we compare them to what we see going on with Muslim women in the world, it's not an exaggeration to say that we see the good, the bad, and the truly horrific, right? And some of the issues that come up, and I'm not going to dwell on any of them at length. Again, if you have questions in this area, I'm happy to talk about them further, because I know what I think. I'd like you to guide the conversation. But when we think about Muslim women in the world today, the headlines tell us that what we should fixate on are hijab headscarf, or whether a woman covers her hair or not, how she's dressed. There's a lot of time and attention paid to how a woman is dressed. Or to atrocious acts like female genital mutilation, honor killings, acid attacks, stonings, beatings, women being forced to cover, again, going back to clothing, or women being banned from seeking an education. All of these ripped from the headlines issues, however, particularly female genital mutilation, honor killings, acid attacks, stonings, beatings, have no foundation in the Quran. In many cases, when it comes to honor killings, but honor killings or female genital mutilation, these are pre-Islamic practices that existed in many cultures and countries. And in some cases, when Islam became the faith of the country over time, some put a religious veneer, an Islamic veneer, on honor killings, as if to make them sound like they could be justified by Islam, or female genital mutilation. We do have a practice of circumcision of boys, right? Right after birth. We do have that practice, and so some would twist that to say that, oh, well, girls should be circumcised too. But then, of course, what they're promoting is more than what anyone might even consider something symbolic or beneficial, let's say. These are pre-Islamic practices that have been unable to be eradicated for one reason or another. What we miss in the headlines around these issues is that there are Muslim women and men on the ground in these countries who are actively fighting back against these practices and who are winning progress, who have become activists on the ground. Some of you may have seen, it was an Oscar-winning documentary a couple of years ago called Saving Face. MPAC honored it with a media award. It was a documentary about a Pakistani-American physician who had partnered with a Pakistani woman in Pakistan who was working with acid burn survivors. And he was a plastic surgeon in America. And they teamed up to help these women rebuild their faces and also rebuild their lives. And they themselves are the activists on the front lines who are pushing back against these atrocities. And when it comes to stonings and these other kinds of practices, again, these are, I'll paint a broad brush when it comes to these sort of extreme interpretations and also lump ISIS in that category. And groups like Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab, these extreme fringe voices that for the average Muslim represent, they're what the KKK is to Christianity is how we look at ISIS or Al-Qaeda or Al-Shabaab or Boko Haram, that they are recreating, reinventing, distorting, disgracing our faith in the process for their own ends. And again, women and men are fighting back. When we think about girls being banned from education by the Taliban, we have one of our most powerful symbols of resistance, Malala. Who doesn't know the story of this young girl and her father, right, who pushed for girls' education, pushed back against the Taliban, and even when there was an assassination attempt and she nearly lost her life, God saved her for a bigger purpose, right? So I'd like to believe. And so she has directed her life now. She just turned 18. And she is a Nobel Peace Prize winner and an active advocate for girls' education, and which is a campaign that's now been adopted by First Lady Michelle Obama and others, the Let Girls Learn, right, campaign. Women are taking the reins in fighting back against many of these outdated and horrific and un-Islamic practices themselves. So that's a lot of the ugly that we're seeing. Now, I said I wasn't going to dwell on stereotypes, and this is the only sentence that I will use to summarize what those stereotypes are. Because for me, as a communications person, I've been on the front lines of dealing with bad news around Islam and Muslims for 15 years. And when I think about how media tells stories about Muslims, I'm not as angry as I used to be, I will say that, because I think that there's more space, there's more platforms than ever before, especially with social media, so that we can have access to more diverse voices. And yet I still see that within mainstream media that there are really three main narratives or options available in storytelling. whether it's news or Hollywood. That the first is the typical the typical angry Muslim, right? But the flip side, when we think about portrayals of Muslim women, are first that we're either oppressed and silent, right? Just picture a burqa, right? The head to toe silencing or erasure. And that's the most dominant image that we see in most mainstream media, right? Is a woman either fully covered or partially covered, and she's rarely speaking. Not because she doesn't want to speak, but because it's B-roll, right? They're images of these women rather than giving them the agency. An ugly version in our American politics that happened recently was where Ghazala and Khizr Khan, the parents of a US military veteran who was killed in Iraq, when they spoke at the DNC. What was Donald Trump's reaction? Oh, well, why wasn't that woman speaking? There must have been, there must have been something going on there, right? You tell me. This attack on the mother of a fallen American soldier and attaching it to this stereotype, this gross stereotype around, her husband didn't allow her to speak, and trying to twist the story in that direction rather than focusing on the loss, the service, and the very Americanness of this family. So that's one. Another version of our story is troubling to me is the Muslim woman is the survivor or is the liberated one. And this is often where Muslim women are portrayed, or ex-Muslim women, right? Or women who take off their hijab. And I have no judgment about that. It's about free will and free choice. And I'm happy to talk about hijab in more depth if you would like. But this idea that the only way to be liberated is to move away from Islam is really troubling because it erases space for people like me or women like me. And then the third group, that is the promising group of stories, is still insufficient. And that's the group of stories where Muslim women defy the stereotype, right? And that's why I've had more stories told about me and other Muslim women I know that usually include that phrase. Here they go, defying the stereotype. And to me, it's sort of a backhanded compliment because, sure, I'm defying your stereotype, but I'm typical. Right? And even when my story is told, or the stories of women like me are told, we're still defined against the stereotype, right? Like that's the norm and we're the exception. And in many ways, that's also my experience with media. You heard that in my bio? Yeah, I do media. It's not glamorous though. What it means is that I'm a morning after girl. When bad news happens, that's when my phone rings, right? And so this is the challenge for the average American Muslim. And I can't leave a room in America where somebody doesn't ask me, where are the moderate voices? Or why aren't Muslims condemning terrorism? In more polite places, why aren't Muslims condemning terrorism more, right? The acknowledgement that at least it's happening. Why aren't we hearing it? And part of my contention is that when the only times that you hear my voice or the voices of other mainstream American Muslims in the context of bad news, we're still associated with bad news. That's still the reference point. And that's not exactly a teachable moment or a warm and open moment. So there's a lot of complexity here. But I want to take the last few minutes to talk about what's really promising and to focus us instead on Muslim women who are leading the charge and who are far more representative of the vast majority of Muslim women worldwide who don't just have their rights, but are utilizing their rights. So we're hopeful, that shouldn't be political in a church, we may have our first female president this year, God willing. And when we think about the Muslim world, it's often easy to say, oh, that's where women are oppressed. But the truth is that there have been 5 female heads of state in Muslim-majority countries over multiple decades. Those include Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Mauritius, and Albania, neighbor to where my family's from. So we in America here might catch up, right? There are also, in the last decade, there have been 3 Nobel Peace Prize winners who have been Muslim women. I mentioned Malala already. there was also Shireen Ebadi, who is an Iranian civil rights, human rights attorney who fought for women's rights and children's rights within Iran. And there was also Tawakkul Karman, the Yemeni woman in hijab who was one of the lead organizers of Yemeni when as part of the Arab Spring, when Yemen had its turn. It was squashed, unfortunately. But she was one of the main organizers of this movement to resist the Yemeni government. These are women who were inspiring other Muslim women, who were holding up a torch and lighting the torches of other women. I read a great quote by Gloria Steinem where somebody said to her, so are you ready to pass on the torch? And she said, no, I'm going to hold on to my torch, thank you very much, and I'm going to light as many other torches as I can do. And that's what I see many of these women doing. Now also, in the last 5 years, there is a new English translation of the Quran that was done by a Muslim woman named Lale Bakhtiar. There was last year a translation and interpretation of the Quran done by a team of 5 American Muslim scholars, including a woman. Women are getting their voices more and more heard in these religious spaces. More and more mosques around the country are led by women, including the Islamic Center of Southern California, one of our interfaith partners here at All Saints. There were 14 Muslim women who won medals at the Olympics this year from all around the world, including at least 2 American Muslim women. Ibtihaj Muhammad, the first woman to compete in a hijab on behalf of the United States of America, an African-American woman fencer. Talk about defying stereotypes, right? Also, Dalila Muhammad, an African-American Muslim woman who doesn't wear hijab, who wore the usual running outfit, and won a 400-meter gold medal in the 400-meter. These are women who are equally Muslim, equally proud, but we fixate on one more than the other. There are also women in policy-making positions. Some of you may have famously heard of Homa Abedin, Hillary Clinton's right-hand woman. There's also Rumana Ahmed, a hijab-wearing woman who works in the White House as a policy advisor. And there's also another interfaith partner of ours, Aziza Hassan, who is executive director of New Ground, a Muslim-Jewish Partnership for Change here in Los Angeles, who was last year named to President Obama's White House Faith-Based and Neighborhood Advisory Committee. We have a lot to be proud of. We also have here in Los Angeles last year the birth of the Women's Mosque of America, the first all-women's prayer space that provides a monthly congregational prayer just for women, a spiritual space to elevate them, empower them to go back into their co-ed mosques and serve and deepen and lead. We also have seen Dalia Mugahed, who worked with Gallup, who has been on The Daily Show and other places, who did an amazing TED Talk that went viral, and who's leading on collecting data about and by American Muslims. You wouldn't believe that up until maybe 8 years ago, there wasn't much great data on American Muslims. When we thought about how many American Muslims there are, we relied on projections, not polls and data. Gallup broke through that, led by Dalia Mugahed. When she moved on from Gallup, she joined a group called the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, which is sort of the first American Muslim think tank, poll tank, study tank. And they are producing data that is helping us to know ourselves so that we can meet our challenges head on. So these are examples of the kinds of Muslim women that I know and that I'm inspired by every day. And they're average, normal, typical women. They're not out of the ordinary. They're not the exception. They are the rule. In fact, American Muslim women only rank second to American Jewish women in their levels of educational attainment. That's the norm. And so in the last portion that I would like to sort of stir the pot with before we move into questions is what is actually making Muslim women visible? Is what is making Muslim women visible these areas of attainment where they're breaking through glass ceilings, through barriers, through stereotypes? Or is it just more bad news? It's a little bit of both in my mind, but still, the bad news edges out any possibility for good news. Because certainly ISIS's actions towards women cast a pall over everything that all other Muslims do. But on the other hand, Muslim women, again, are taking the reins, and they're being supported by alliances from people of all different backgrounds. Most recently, when we think about, do you remember the French burkini ban? Like a month ago? Doesn't that seem like a long time ago already? Now, this was another manufactured controversy in the wake of the Nice terrorist attack. Seeing women in bikinis, and I hate that term because a woman wearing what's essentially a rash guard and pants, right? A wetsuit with a skirt over it is not the same thing as a burqa, right? That offends me. A burqa erases an identity. A full-length swimsuit empowers a woman to be able to live her life, right, and enjoy her life and be able to swim. And it inspired this campaign, this social media campaign called Wear What You Want. And that was an incredible, and this is what I'm loving seeing and being inspired by, is seeing how Muslim women are pushing back and showing all the different things that they wear. That rather than fixating, again, on the stereotype or on the bad, it's filling the gap. Like, oh, you want to know what we wear? Let me show you what we wear, right? And all the different ways that Muslim women in their surgical scrubs, right? Or a police uniform. And by the way, the state of Minnesota just hired its first police officer in hijab, the first in the country to do that because they allowed it within their uniform policy. And she's a Somali-American 21-year-old woman. That sense of inclusion is a powerful symbol of where we can go. And it's incredibly important because when we think about the cost for not doing that, for not embracing one another, we see the terrible toll that we're seeing in hate crimes on the other side. This period of the last few months has had the highest spike in hate crimes that we've seen against American Muslims since the days right after 9/11. And one of those incidents that particularly hit close to home for me was there's been a high concentration in New York itself. And around possibly the 15th anniversary of 9/11 and this election season, a lot of things get stirred up. But there were two Muslim mothers in hijab walking down the street, pushing their kids in strollers, when they were stopped and attacked by another woman who shouted racial epithets at them, punched one woman in the face, tried to pull off the scarf of the other woman, and tried to yank away a stroller from one of those women, all while shouting racial and religious epithets at them. And this woman ended up being charged, in a hate crime. And this example is one that's so vivid. I mean, luckily they all survived minor injuries and everything. But imagine now to be a Muslim woman in America and to hear that story, right? It hits so close to home. Muslim women, whether they cover or not, are on the front lines in many ways, because of visibility, and maybe because of accessibility. And this is where we have, again, both an opportunity and an obligation to tell our stories. And so I thank you today for making this space for me to share my story and the stories of actual Muslim women and what we're doing, and for your curiosity in this subject. And I also request for your partnership. It is more moving than I have words for to know that All Saints has a sign outside that says All Saints stands with its Muslim neighbors. I know that, and I feel that as a Muslim. And I look to you, the All Saints community, as one of my cherished partners in the quest to allow and create opportunities for more people to know Muslims firsthand, rather than through television screens and film screens, because that's the one thing that makes all the difference. And as we've learned in our own community, especially by the example of the LGBTQ movement, the power of coming out, the power of getting personal, the power of engaging one-on-one. American Muslims are doing that more and more, and they're opening their hearts and their minds and their homes and their spaces. And I am really, again, grateful that you are our partners in that journey. I look forward to your ideas for how we can continue to work together. So I'm going to stop here, and we have how much time left for questions? 5 minutes? Uh-oh, I didn't do very well. Sure.
It's a really hot mic. So
Oh.
you need to be right in it.
I'm sorry. Sorry about that.
Okay, raise your hands if you have questions. Can we take a couple?
Thank you for beginning your talk with reference to verses in the Quran. As you know, in Christianity, when we come to gender issues, we have a deep divide between the fundamentalists who base their arguments on a 16th century version, and those of us progressives, I would call us radicals, who are doing a critical interpretation and going back to original sources. In your use of the Quran, in that one verse that you quoted in full, is that an interpretation accepted by Muslim traditional scholars, or is it something that you have differences over?
Great question. So that verse, because we believe as Muslims that the Quran is the literal revealed word of God, they can't argue over the verse, because the verse says men and women, you know, and all of that. Where we have challenges in Muslim tradition is in the same place that you have challenges in the Christian tradition, right? Is around the body of interpretation that exists, and whose interpretation rises to the top and which ones fall to the side. And that is where the reform that everyone is looking for, right, is taking place. But for many, it's counterintuitive. For many outside the Muslim community, it's counterintuitive to think that the reform that we need in Islam is to go back to the Quran rather than away from the Quran, to rely more on the literal word of God and less on the human interpretation of the literal word of God. Because the Quran provides us with more clear principles. And the one place I would say that we need more interpretation, maybe there's two, is around issues that we're focused on time and place. So rules around inheritance, it's not one-to-one inheritance in the Quranic prescription for men and women. When it comes to, there's a verse in the Quran that many argue allows room for if there is a dispute between a man and a woman. And again, the Quran is patriarchal. I mean, it's traditional family centered, right? So that it allows a man as a last resort to raise his hand, right, or to hit a woman. Some would argue that. That verse needs more work. The verse around that allows for polygamy or needs more interpretation, because what it did was reduce polygamy from an unlimited amount of wives to 4 if you were able to provide for them equally and care for them equally. I think that those two, I don't know anybody who can love 2 people equally. That's just me. There's more work to be done in specific areas, but I think going back to the Quran is where a lot of these answers are. And in Islam, this is called ijtihad. It's the idea of the jihad of the mind, intellectual jihad, where you struggle with the text. It's about critical reasoning. And so we have within our tradition this idea of constantly going back to the text and reinterpreting and separating the fixed from the flexible. But that's not what the Wahhabis, right, our ultra-Orthodox, that is not what our ultra-Orthodox teach. They teach that it's all black and white, right, like you have in your community, we have in our community. But the space of the moderates and the progressives is growing ever larger. So that's the good news. And that there's more literature and scholarship coming from the West that's applicable to us in the West is also a good sign.
Okay, last question, Betsy.
Thank you so much, Edina. As always, you really enlighten us and tell us things that we really need to hear. I would like to just remind all of us here that All Saints is a part of an interfaith study group, and we have a meeting this coming Sunday, not today, next week, which will be at the Islamic Center of Southern California. Mm-hmm. And it has to do with 2 individuals, one a Muslim and one a Christian, who specialize in immigration information and helping people who are coming to this country become part of our country. So thank you for that.
You're so welcome. The Islamic Center will also host an open mosque day on October 23rd. So if any of you are interested in visiting a mosque, October 23rd is your day. Oh, that's a good question. I don't know, but the Women's Mosque usually has its service on the last Friday of every month. It is women only, sorry. And it takes place Fridays at 1 o'clock, and you're welcome to attend that, womensmosque.com.
I think we're going to have to.
Can I just ask two questions? One is, are you bound by Sharia law? And are you allowed to drive? I mean, all kinds of things we're very interested in. Thank you.
Sure. What you're referring to are Saudi laws. So Saudi Arabia and Iran are the only two countries in the world that force a woman to cover. And this is in direct violation of the Quran. The Quran says there is no compulsion in matters of faith. It's not my interpretation, those are the words. There's no compulsion in matters of faith. So anything that crosses that line includes telling women how to dress. And so those are violations of Islam. Women not being able to drive is only in Saudi Arabia, and women are defying that ban, and they're using social media to tell their story. And so, yeah, so there's a lot more than meets the eye.
Thank you. Let's all thank Edina, and come to the event this afternoon if you can. Thanks.